Ian Speers, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you so much.
For our audience, Ian Speers is the co-founder and CEO of Pacto Medical, a medical device and logistics company slash logistics. We'll dive into that in the specifics shortly. That's trying to really revolutionize and reimagine one of the most simple, one of the most vital medical instruments that we use on the planet today. So let's dive into Ian, why you chose to start this company, firstly.
Sure. Thanks. Well, my background is in healthcare. I've been an EMT for over 10 years and also in public health and medical logistics, where I previously managed medical logistics, emergency responses, and public health programs, primarily in Africa and the Middle East. And over the course of those years, I both learned how important prefilled syringes are to clinicians and how challenging they can be to move in really long and complicated supply chain journeys, and realized that we didn't have access to this really important technology in a lot of places where we were working because of, for one reason, how it was designed. The physical product itself is just far bulkier than it needs to be. And so we started to think about, how do we miniaturize this? How do we reduce the packaging footprint to make it more affordable and easier to get to the places that it needs to go?
Absolutely. Well, let's dive into that specifically, right? I imagine a syringe, it's pretty small generally, but you're trying to shrink it further. And tell us a little bit about, I guess, what is the uniqueness of the product itself?
Sure. So stepping back, I guess, about prefilled syringes, there are 7 billion of them used every year around the world. And you can have all sorts of medications and solutions in these prefilled syringes. And they're filled aseptically at the point of manufacture and then shipped to the point of use, where then you don't need to deal with drawing up from vials and ampules with an empty syringe. Instead, you're pretty much ready to go. The challenge is, when we moved from drawing up from vials and ampules to prefilled syringes, we didn't really change the design of the syringe itself. We just decided we're going to prefill it now. But when you prefill these syringes, then you have this plunger rod that's sticking out at the end, this plastic plunger rod that's taking up almost half of the space in the packaging. And that's completely unnecessary in our minds. So what we've done is we've redesigned that. We haven't played with anything that touches the medication itself. We haven't redesigned the body of the syringe. We've created 2 proprietary components that create it so that the plunger rod can be clipped onto the side of the body of the syringe when it's being shipped. And then when it's ready to use, you unclip it, insert it into our stopper insert, and then you're ready to go. But what that does is it saves 40% of the shipping volume, the packaging volume, up until that point of use.
That's very interesting. And sometimes people think about entrepreneurship and innovation. You need to build this brand new revolutionary product. And in part this is, but you're also trying to do something that's very simple, right? And like a fundamental efficiency improvement to an existing product.
Exactly. It was taking a clear challenge and frustration from lived experience and saying, instead of continuing to struggle to move these things through the existing supply chain, which we're also trying to improve the efficiency, other companies are working on that. But let's go back to the actual design of it. Have we really made it as efficient and effective as we can, especially for low resource settings, right? For other higher resource settings, people have been kind of okay with reduced efficiency there. They throw a little bit more money at it, and it works. But we really need to be thoughtful. If we're trying to promote health equity everywhere in the world, we want to make sure people have access to the medical products they need, and making sure that they physically get there is a really important part of that.
Yeah. For our audience, let's dive into the market size, right? Why is this an entrepreneur? And I believe if it is a for-profit business, it's a company itself, right?
Yes, exactly. It's a C corp.
Right. You
And
yeah. You mentioned specifically that there was 7 billion syringes, this pre-filled syringes used per year, right? That's a lot, right? That's a decent market cap. That's a decent size of a product being used. Who are the ones that are the major manufacturers in this space currently?
yeah, so it depends on the medication or solution that's inside the pre-filled syringe. But some of the largest players are BD, which is Beck& Dickinson, and Nipro and Gerresheimer. But there are a variety of also contract manufacturers that produce pre-filled syringes for generic medications or, for example, sterile saline. So there are a lot of potential partners for us out there to work with.
And as you mentioned, you've had experience directly in the field in Africa, working on this experience. You're an EMT. What are the most typical pre-filled medical products, right? What are the shots themselves? What is this mostly used for?
Yeah, it varies by the size of the syringe, and pre-filled syringes can go from all the way down to zero point 0.5 milliliters up to 20 milliliters or more. What we've been focusing on is the 10 milliliter range, and a really large segment of that is sterile saline. And this is actually just sterile water, so to speak, but it's used to start and clear lines for IVs, and to push medications in through the IV line if they're administered intravenously. And that alone is hundreds of millions of just sterile saline 10 ml solutions every year. When you get down to lower sizes, you can also have vaccines in pre-filled syringes, and that's a really important market to be aware of as well, especially when we're talking about access to healthcare and health equity here.
Absolutely. Well, let's get into specifically, for this product itself, right? You mentioned that it saves space. It is meant to, of course, help hopefully achieve more resources for the for wherever people may need them. What would be the desired goal for costs, right, for this product to achieve in order to both save space, save costs, so that more space can be used, in the delivery logistical process, versus perhaps, for our audience, how much a typical syringe of the roughly same size would cost.
Sure. Our goal, once we hit scale with producing our proprietary components, would be that ours cost about the same amount, which is 7 cents, as the existing plunger rods. Our plunger rods take up about as much plastic as current plunger rods do. It's just a different design. So we're confident that at scale we can reach that same price. And then the price of the rest of the syringe is dependent on the size and the medication inside of it. But for sterile saline, for example, depending where you buy it from, right now, one 10 ml sterile saline syringe is about $1.
Mhm.
So our goal would be to put our plunger rod, incorporate that into a company's design, such as Beck& Dickinson's design, and then they would be able to price it lower because of their supply chain savings. And then they would get some of the savings, and the customer would get some of the savings. The savings that you see from this are, just for transport alone, around 35%. And so there are also other savings in storage and sterilization. We're reducing the amount of packaging we're using. So the cents add up at every point of the supply chain, and then you're really getting the savings from the supply chain side of things, not necessarily the manufacturing. So same price manufacturing, lower cost to get it into everyone's hands.
Absolutely. And for the customer, for the customer's lens, for the perspectives, right? It's not going to be individual consumers buying these. It's going to be hospitals. It's going to be NGOs. Like, who are going to be the major purchasers typically of these medical devices?
Yeah, it'll be a variety of different healthcare organizations. It can be a Ministry of Health. It can be a for-profit, nonprofit healthcare organization. It can be a non-governmental organization. All of the above. There are a lot of potential customers out there. It could also be, research institutions, academic institutions that are using prefilled syringes in their labs. But yeah, generally not an individual consumer.
Yeah. Well, ultimately, of course, it is for the benefit of the individual consumer. Maybe getting it more affordably to them, getting it more sustainably, which is not good for society. But let's dive into the company itself. You formed this during your time here at Harvard, and while you were doing your master's in public health, I believe.
Mhm.
Tell us about the idea itself, idea to action that you've taken to now have a tangible product that you're kind of building.
Yeah, I had a notebook of these frustrating medical devices that I had been tasked over the year to move through really complicated supply chains, and I felt like could be redesigned to be more efficient and effective in those settings. And when I finally got to grad school, I had a little bit more time and had some amazing resources at school to actually think about diving into some of those projects. But my background is not in engineering. And so I quickly realized I needed to bring on some serious engineers and product managers to help me bring this idea into something that you could actually hold in your hand, which is what we have today in a 3D printed version. And so I went back through personal connections and immediately thought of another co-founder, Robert Halverson, who was an engineer and a good friend of mine, actually, from undergrad at Dartmouth. And he had been working at all sorts of different engineering companies after graduating. And he also had a master's in integrated products and services, which is really from Carnegie Mellon, which was taking business and engineering and putting it into one. And so it's the perfect fit. And I called him up. I pitched him on these ideas. And thankfully, he immediately jumped on board because he had been looking for a project like this. And so then he also brought in another co-founder, Ryan Steinbaugh, who was also a student at Carnegie Mellon in that same master's program, and they were friends as well. And Ryan also has amazing experience in engineering and business and operations. And so the three of us ended up founding the company a couple months later and have been going ever since.
Absolutely. Well, that's fantastic. And, for many entrepreneurs out there, they're going to typically start, if they're going to build a startup, typically they're going to be more likely than not to build it at first, at least for their first entrepreneurial endeavor, to build it with the team, like yourself. What was the concept behind, building it out with two other co-founders for yourself? Was it kind of focusing on different skill sets versus, as you scale company, you would hire employee, I guess. For yourself, where was kind of the dividing line conceptual between co-founders and then building out an employee team at some point?
Yeah, for the co-founder team, I think it's really important to have a couple of things. Number one is trust, especially early on in an IP-centric business. You really need to know and trust your co-founders. And so working within personal existing networks was very helpful for that. The second thing is having complementary skill sets and technical skills. So I immediately admitted I don't have the engineering background, and so I needed that to round out the team. And then the third is kind of temperament and ways of thinking. You don't want a entire co-founding team to all act or think or do in the exact same way when you're trying to build an innovative product and company. You want people who think differently, and some people who push, and some people who pull, and some people who are a little quieter sometimes and then speak up when there's a key issue, and other people who are just going all the time. And because that brings out ideas, and that allows you to work on things and work in ways that you couldn't by yourself. And so we have all of those things in our co-founding team. We have the spark, we have the steadiness, we have the glue, so to speak. We have a really well-rounded team, and now we've started to build it out as well with 4 different advisors and 3 different fellows, 2 of which are actually also from Harvard School of Public Health.
Well, that's fantastic Harvard representation. Let's dive into the nitty-gritty, right? For our audience, building a startup it might seem glamorous on the outside, but you're logging in, a lot of long, difficult hours, making a tangible for yourself, especially a tangible real-world product. There's the logistical end. There's a lot of work that you do. And as you build a startup, you have to think about, who does what work. And we've also seen startups, often those that don't work out necessarily. There might be conflicts among the co-founders. There might be difficulties, right? So there are some hard conversations. And in previous episodes, we've dove into a little bit of that as well. So let's dive into for our listeners who might be interested in starting their own entrepreneurial endeavor, to think about these things perhaps more effectively. So for you and your co-founders, how did you think about the division of equity, and did you do the standard vesting period for kind of how this endeavor might lay out in the next, not just now, right, but in the next few years?
Yeah, we did. I mean, we operated on trust, and we took a while before we drew up any paperwork and incorporated. And then when we incorporated, we did a standard 4-year vesting period with a 1-year cliff, which is the general advice we've received. And then we've also been bringing advisors on board. And after a decent amount of time with them, then we also do some equity awards there, because we're trying to make sure that while we can't compensate everyone with as high of a hourly wage as you would like, especially early in a startup's journey, we want to make sure that we are compensating people appropriately for their time and effort and knowledge. And so we're continuing to work on that. And as we're bringing more people into the team, it's a continued discussion. But we've been operating on a pretty slim budget, mostly through accelerators, pitch competitions, and other grants at this point. We're going into our pre-seed round to do our first dilutive funding coming up, and that'll help us again make sure that we have the cash to pay people appropriately.
Absolutely. Well, let's dive into the funding mechanism a little bit as well, right? You had the idea, you've incorporated. What was the process of getting to these resources, and which resources did you initially pursue? You mentioned grants, you mentioned accelerators. For our audience, what might be the most effective tools to get your thing started, especially for folks who might be, didn't do a startup before, or there's new in the space, they might need to pitch in a few $1,000s of their own money to get things running first. What was kind of the first few steps for yourself and your team?
Yeah, so I think often when people talk about fundraising, they immediately go to dilutive fundraising and feel like they need to raise, and the value or success of your project or company is based on how much money you raise. And I think it's important to accept that that's not true. You should only raise when you need to raise, and you should only raise the amount of money that you need for both logistical reasons and otherwise. And so we knew early on that this is a pretty low capital project. And so before we had before we were too far along, we wanted to make sure that we were, just spending money that we needed to spend. We wanted to make sure that we weren't taking outside investment too early. And so for that, we looked to accelerators such as the Harvard iLabs, to Dartmouth Green Shot, and others. We have done a variety of pitch competitions. We're grateful to have won one of the Ingenuity Awards at the President's Innovation Challenge last year, and have been getting grants through some other programs as well. And that's been working out very well for us at this point. We're also now working to apply to SBIRs, which are another important funding mechanism for startup founders to think about. It's equity-free grants from the U.S. government. A variety of different institutions and departments in the government provide them. For us, we're looking at NIH and NSF, and they have a variety of different phases of these SBIRs. That's a really good way to de-risk and test your product before accepting outside capital. It can also be a mix of things, right? It doesn't have to be one or the other. And it's important to have ideas and ways to bridge between non-dilutive funding and grants and these long government grant timelines. And so that's where we see private investment coming in to make sure that we can sustain between those different grant periods.
Those are a lot of options. I'm sure some folks maybe not have been entirely aware, and that's absolutely fantastic, as you mentioned, to get, especially a medical, right, a science-oriented startups. A lot of these government resources are especially relevant for folks that might be tackling this space where you need to be generally a fairly large institution to kind of be in the market, and the government does support these major medical endeavors. Now that you're going into your first, for our audience, pre-seed stage, which typically is a much smaller check size relatively than to a Series A, which is where you would probably raise a decent amount, 7-8 figures, I would say, is the norm now for Series A. What's kind of the goal for the raise for a pre-seed stage in your mind?
Yeah, for pre-seed, we're going for $350,000. So still relatively low. And we have budget lines attached to every dollar there. And again, that's really important. It's not coming up with an amount of money out of thin air because it sounds good or you want to say you've been able to raise a certain amount, but knowing what you're going to do with that money over what period of time and what deliverables you're going to then be able to show to your investors. That's all absolutely important. And so based on that, we've landed on 350.
And what are you imagining the valuation or roughly the company would be roughly aiming for from a pre-seed stage, and kind of the standard, your thoughts perhaps on the standard goal of growing it from, pre-money valuation to post-money valuation, and then maybe to like a seed stage at a certain point?
Yeah, it is challenging to put a valuation on the company this early on, and especially when it's a IP-centric company. We've submitted our U.S. utility and our PCT patent applications, but it takes time for those to then be adjudicated and hopefully awarded. And so what those patents look like in the end also impacts the valuation. And so right now we've actually decided to go with the fundraising mechanism of a safe, an uncapped safe with about a 20% discount, because it's really challenging to value the company right now.
For our audience, could you explain what a safe is and kind of like how you're offering that discount essentially for folks that might just put in the money now without a specific cap, and then I believe they would buy in at the next stage?
Sure. Yeah. So a safe is actually a mechanism started by Y Combinator, and it's a very founder-friendly device for especially early stage companies where it's challenging to put an exact valuation to the company. And it's a simple agreement for future equity. That's how you get the SAFE acronym. And so you pay, you provide a check today, and then you get the SAFE agreement. And with a 20% discount, that means at the next point that there is, for seed or for Series A, you would then get a 20% discount at that round. So it's acknowledging that you're taking on a little bit more risk early on as being a really early investor, and as the valuation is still being discovered and created. But it's a well known and well used mechanism that I think is really great for founders.
Is there a typical type of startup that typically uses safe VC funding versus kind of the standard dilutive funding mechanisms?
I mean, this is my first startup, and I'm learning as I go as well. In my experience, a safe is pretty common across industries, but our focus and our advisors and everyone we work with is focused on the medical industry. So at least that's where it's used relatively regularly. There are other options, including convertible notes, where you can provide some some cash back as you go along, in the form of dividends. But the safe is, in my experience and where we are right now, is the preferred mechanism for us.
Absolutely. Well, let's dive into now specifically your kind of interest, right? In this, you mentioned that you've worked a number of years, as we previously discussed. What was the kind of what was the kind of mindset to focus on syringes?
Yeah, I think you have to eventually focus on a problem. When you want to start a company,
Yeah,
you have to focus in on one problem to start with, do that really well, and then you can grow from there. But it's important to have something and a tangible idea to then start working on. You have to make sure that idea aligns with all of your values, your mission, your goals. But sometimes you can get really stuck in your mind about really high goals, but you need to end up doing something to achieve those. And so I was frustrated with access to medicine in low resource settings and at the end of elongated supply chains, but getting frustrated about that at home without having a solution to deliver on wasn't helping. And so I knew I needed to take one step and focus on one product first, and then make an impact through that, hopefully.
what was kind of the reasoning behind yourself pursuing a master's in public health, right? From your previous experience as an EMT, and you've had medical experience as a medical professional, not only here in the US, but globally.
Yeah, so my undergrad was, I'd say, a public health sort of education from a social science perspective. I did psychology and medical anthropology and geography and global health. And so that's really the background I exited undergrad with, and then went into program management for public health with. And then after 4 or so years of doing that, I realized that there was still a lot more to learn about public health programs, policies, and that I needed to go back to school to focus in on that even more. And it's pretty common to have a master's of public health within, for those who are, focusing on public health as their career. And so it was a logical next step for me.
Yeah. Well, let's dive into the whole medical field, right? That, as you mentioned, it's it's a multi-trillion-dollar industry globally. I believe, I think we're spending that much at this point. Um, you know, and as we enter further into the 21st century, there's going to be more and more challenges with health as the population grows older. Um, was all the spending was how big the industry is, why wasn't perhaps this product, this efficiency identified sooner and by the companies that are receiving billions, if not tens of billions in revenues for manufacturing these very common devices? Well, why hasn't the innovation happened already?
Sure. So the really interesting thing is that some other companies, including actually Beck& Dickinson, have tried to solve this problem before. There are some patents out there for compact or assemblable syringes.
Mm,
They all have pretty much all have three main design flaws with them, though. One is that they're incredibly complex, right? So they can break easily, they can't withstand the brunt of the supply chain, and their mechanisms are incredibly expensive and challenging to make because they're really complicated designs. The second design flaw is that most of them redesign almost the entire syringe. So that includes the body of the syringe. And what that means is that then you have to redo almost all of the tooling and manufacturing process. So it's not a drop-in solution, whereas ours is. And then you have a really large barrier to implementing this new design. And the third is that they don't have the space savings that ours has. So ours is approximately 40% smaller than conventional pre-filled syringes. Other designs don't have that dramatic of savings. And so it's harder to get people to jump on board if you're offering, 10, 15% savings. It's harder to see the big impact of that. And so when we went into this, we looked at all of those patents and listed out what are the issues with them. Why isn't this being implemented today? Because we didn't want to patent something that would then never see the light of day, right? We wanted to figure out, okay, other people also agree this is a really big issue, and they've tried and they haven't gotten something out to market. So we need to think differently. We need to have our design look differently, and we need to operate differently so that hopefully this time we get it right.
absolutely. Well, let's dive into this impact, right? Your goal is to make this more accessible in rural areas. This goal is to, of course, save on the supply chain itself, good for the environment, good for health equity. Where kind of right now do you see would be most impactful in the present day?
Yeah, and I'm glad you brought up the environment there as well. That's another key bottom line value add that we have, which is reducing the amount of packaging we're using and dramatically reducing the amount of carbon that's used to ship these products. Where we see this being most impactful right now is in complex supply chains. And that doesn't necessarily mean really long supply chains. It can, but generally complex supply chains. For instance, when you're moving a cold chain product, something that needs to be kept at a specific temperature throughout its supply chain journey, that gets really expensive really fast, and space really matters there. And so we're able to save a lot more money per syringe when comparing the conventional prefilled syringe to our syringe in that sort of setting, or when you have just really low capacity to transport products. So when at the end of the supply chain, you're taking a very small plane or a helicopter or one car, you want to make sure that you're getting as much bang out of that buck as you can. And so that's where having 40% more space is a real big value add. We're also looking to implement this in areas where providers are already using and familiar with pre-filled syringes. Again, there still are many places that draw up solutions from vials and ampules, and that will always be the best practice for some indications, because you might not know exactly how much of a medication you need, it's weight-based, etc. But for other cases, if pre-filled syringes are a good option, we want the provider to already be familiar with those, so that's an easier switch for them. After that, though, we will then move into, again, trying to convert people from filling with vials and ampules over to pre-filled syringes when that's appropriate for the healthcare setting.
What are some ongoing challenges you see with the, I guess, shots are shots. Not everybody likes, generally you don't have to like them, but they're important. Within the space, obviously, having something be pre-filled, sort of like a product you buy in a store, theoretically you buy it, there's protection around it. We've seen and this might be a more broader medical public health question for you. We've seen rising concerns with, of course, vaccines and other, necessities for shots. There's this increased skepticism around that. Do you feel that perhaps these pre-filled syringes addresses those concerns or heightens perhaps those concerns around, like, oh, is this been tampered with or is it not safe? And perhaps your own, from your educational expertise, your thoughts on this kind of rising skepticism in some degrees in some areas of the world around, trusting or the need to get shots because I don't know what's in the shots themselves, right?
Sure. I think that's an interesting question to explore, and there definitely is more apprehension in general, especially coming out of COVID-19, in some communities about vaccines, shots in general. Some of that apprehension will be there whether it's a pre-filled syringe or not, and is best addressed through public health communication and building trust through and with local communities who hold some of that apprehension. And so a lot of that work does take place outside of the medical device or its packaging itself. To zoom in on a slightly different issue within that, though, is for people who are concerned about the sterility or the accuracy of the dosing they're receiving in a healthcare facility, for example. Pre-filled syringes have been shown to be to result in more accurate dosing and to be more sterile, because again, they're filled in a sterile environment and then packaged and then brought to the point of use, instead of something being drawn up on site in a non-sterile environment like an emergency department room, under pressure, with other people, with other things on providers' minds. Mistakes happen. That's understandable. And so hospitals and nurses, they want things to be in pre-filled syringes when possible and when appropriate. It's faster for them, it's more convenient for them, it's safer for them. There are fewer interactions with needles actually in that. There are fewer tasks you have to do with a needle, and so it's actually safer for the providers. So it is a really good solution from that perspective. But that's a little different than the apprehension about shots in general. And for those who don't like shots, there are some other companies that are working on needleless injections or patch-based injections.
And for yourself, what is the goal of a particular medical company? We've seen Moderna, kind of the big, incredible growth, but it was a medical company that was built on the back of a successfully produced vaccine for the COVID-19, specific situation, and now they've scaled to other ventures. For yourself, is Pacto a one-off medical device specifically for this IP? Or do you imagine, should this, of course, product be economically viable, scalable, and you've built into a successful business revenue stream, that perhaps the company would also look into expansion to other future products as well?
Sure. So our focus right now is on pre-filled syringes, but there's a lot of extra ground that we can still cover after this product right here. We can scale and change our design for different sizes of syringes, which we're continuing to do. We can make it more compatible for syringes that have safety needles that retract after the injection is completed. And we can also scale to make sure that this works with different types of syringes and different types of environments, whether it be extreme cold chain or a different size or design of a body of a syringe, because unfortunately not all syringes, a syringe is not always a syringe. So there's a lot to work with there. So we're focusing on that landscape at this point, and that will take us a good amount of time to make sure that we can scale and cover all of those challenges. After that, we'll see. Our mission in general is to solve complex and overlooked healthcare and logistical challenges in ways that are economically logical, that help the environment and improve health equity and access to healthcare. So there's a lot that you can do with that. Right now, we feel like our time is being really well spent in the syringe space, though.
Well, this is an excellent point. I think you're about to, as you mentioned, raise pre-seed for your kind of next step. What is kind of the next next few months look like? What is the runway like for you? What are the needs of your company that you're trying to tackle more immediately?
Sure. So right now we have 3D printed prototypes of our design that we've been testing with different users across now 13, I believe, countries at different levels of the supply chain, different medical licensure levels. What we need to do next is move those 3D printed prototypes into an injection molded prototype. So that means tooling and injection molding, and then continued enhanced stakeholder testing with those prototypes, as well as lab testing with those. So looking at how they interact with different temperature, other stresses like dropped and tumble, brake force, things like that. We want to make sure that our product and design can really withstand the brunt of the medical supply chain. Also, we've submitted our patents and our trademark, and we need to make sure that we stay on top of those so that they're granted. And then we're continuing to just map out our our supply chain and make sure that we're understanding everybody who interacts with purchases and makes decisions around prefilled syringes are people that we've talked to. So we're always looking to talk to experts who have experience with prefilled syringes to make sure that we're designing something and co-designing with those stakeholders something that works for them and that they're really excited about. And then obviously we need to raise capital to support all of that growth. After that point, though, we'd be ready to start to bring our design and our IP to different companies that are in the prefilled syringe space to talk about incorporating our design into their products.
Well, that is very fantastic to hear. And I think it's a perfect place to end this episode of the podcast. Ian, thank you very much for joining us and sharing with our audience and hopefully those that are interested in entrepreneurship or the medical devices or medical logistics space to have learned a little bit more about your endeavor and how you're building it even now.
Wonderful. Thank you so much for having me, William.